Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues around architecture and architectural thinking. So this episode I am talking with Kunlé Adeyemi, a Nigerian-born architect who practices mainly out of Amsterdam, but whose practice is located around the world. Kunlé grew up in northern Nigeria, spent some time in Lagos, then was part of OMA, working closely with Rem Koolhaas, and now runs his own practice. I met him first when he came to India and was part of the Chandigarh Urban Lab and taught several studios with me, and we have kept in touch since. I talked to him about working with Rem, working on his own, working globally, and what the state of architecture is in Nigeria, in Africa, and in the world. Here we go. So first of all, welcome to Architecture Talk, Kunlé.
Thank you very much, Vikram. It's good to be here.
All right, so Kunlé, so you're an architect and you have your office in Amsterdam and you work actively in Lagos, in other parts of Africa. And here you are, from what you have told me, you are teaching in Princeton. And we have agreed that you are an international man of mystery and history. Yes?
Trying my best.
And last, when you and I met, well, no, we've met after that also, but some time when we spent time together, we were in Chandigarh in India, and we were teaching in a studio.
Indeed.
So, what's going on here? What's going on? Why are you running around the world? And what is the origins of that? What motivates you to do that?
It's a very good question, Vikram. And it's one that increasingly being asked. I would say, but from different perspectives, and
Yeah.
I think fundamentally I am I'm somewhat nomadic. I was raised in the northern part of Nigeria. I was born in the northern part of Nigeria, and I
Yeah.
remember actually that my father, who was my parents who were from the southern part, so the northern part was Kaduna,
Uh-huh.
and the southern part, Kwara State, which is very close to Lagos.
Yeah.
Um, when I was younger, we've always been traveling and would always move back and forth. We'll go back home to Kwara State from the north every year, and my dad, as an architect who worked in the north, would also travel quite a lot, and I would be part of that trip. So I think experiencing new environments and being mobile has always been part of my upbringing, and just a way of life.
Right.
So it's something I mean, in retrospect now, I'm starting to realize that I've been comfortable in that space. And I went to boarding school quite early. Even I went to Lagos when I was in boarding school quite early, and I would travel back and forth. And then I went to another boarding school up north. So there's always been travel involved in university. There's
Right.
been travel when I started working in Lagos. I probably traveled to all the states in Nigeria, almost all the states in Nigeria, for work, and within a 1 year period, probably over 30 states. So even locally in Nigeria, I've always been traveling, and and
Right.
moving to OMA when I was 25, um, that exposed me very quickly to a lot of traveling also, and as part of work,
Right.
to deal with different people, different cultures, different environments, and that essentially became a way of a way of working, a way of living, a way of learning, a way of getting inspiration, and just my comfort zone. And I think my practice is also currently very focused on looking at different regions in the world and learning from them and cross pollinating ideas that exchange values. So I think I'm also fortunate that I with flying and traveling, I'm generally comfortable and
That's not fair. I mean, because the rest of us suffer.
some you have trouble with jet lag.
Oh God, I hate long flights, man.
I know. I
But
can.
let's talk about that. I'm
Yeah,
interested in this term you used, comfort zone.
hmm,
That sort
yeah,
of nomadism, sort of
yeah, right.
traveling between places and working with different cultures and
Yeah,
different people,
yeah,
instead of being a challenge, what no most people say,
yeah.
is a comfort zone for you. I mean, and learning from various places is a
Yeah.
comfort zone for you. I mean, describe the nature of this comfort, in particular with respect to architectural thinking. What do you mean?
Fundamentally, my practice only where we stand for increasing and promoting diversity and coexistence between humanity and the environment. I would say that's pretty much what I'm interested in.
Right.
And that's what our architecture really is about. How do we promote diversity and increase coexistence between different worlds and different
So
people?
coexistence between different kinds of peoples
Yeah, and the
and
environment
between
and
the
different
environment and the human
yeah,
animal.
and increasing diversity. So um,
Why is that important for you?
because I think that is a healthy trajectory for the development of just human civilization,
Right.
and that we also need to continue to understand that the environment is an incredibly powerful uh, you know condition where
Correct.
we cannot continue to fight, but we
Right.
need to respond and learn to live with it.
And why do you get this sense of you, you live in Amsterdam, but you work significantly in Africa, particularly in Nigeria.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think there's a battlefront between Amsterdam and Nigeria
No,
in
I
some
don't. I
way?
don't think so. I think actually there are so many huge differences, and one could imagine that
Yeah.
it's the most schizophrenic combination between Lagos and Amsterdam. You know, um, you know, different regions, different worlds, different climates, different this. I
Yeah.
mean, at the same time, different economic situations, different complexities,
Right.
different uh, cultures,
Different ethoses of architecture.
sources of architecture, different histories.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I at the same time, I also find interesting um, similarities that are very, very underlying and very, very that somewhat give me a bit of harmony. I think the relationship between the city and the water and the
Uh-huh.
environment
In
is quite
both
similar
cases.
in both
Yeah.
cases. I mean, they're different, let's say, in sort of scale and purpose and use and development, but I think the proximity, uh, is quite similar for me and
So
being in
you think you
different
can apply Dutch water thinking to Lagos water thinking?
and vice versa. I think
And vice versa, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think vice versa. I think you know what I'm learning, what I have learned from a community like Makoko, or
Right.
or
Your
seeing,
school, yeah.
yeah, on seeing how people really just engage in very informal ways with water. I think
Yeah.
some of it still has value in the cities like Amsterdam. And
Have you used it and have you applied it in somewhere in Amsterdam?
we're looking for the opportunities, and I
Yeah.
think we're hoping to be with, find partners that we can have these dialogues with in the future. Things take time, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we've been working really hard on putting getting our work to a point where it has it has the level of tangibility that can be much more appreciated in a place like the Netherlands. So I think we're there now, and these conversations hopefully should start taking place.
Because I think what you are saying, what I am hearing you say, is that obviously we often enough talk about transfer of technology and know-how from, let's say, Amsterdam to Lagos.
Mhm.
But in thinking about a future for the planet that is harmonious in diversity and can deal with the ever more impossible challenges of the environment, perhaps some of the learning for the world is going to come out from Lagos, from places of the global south, and these might have to be understood and adopted by the whole world,
Yeah,
including the north. Yes.
absolutely. I think so, and I think it's both about learning, but also about unlearning.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And part of that is that we have in the sort of western northern, uh, so-called more developed regions of the world,
Right.
um, there's been periods of excess, essentially,
Hmm.
and that has allowed the societies to lose very basic relationships with human and relationship with the environment, and has allowed us to become more dependent on other forms of resources and technologies that are great, are useful, but on a long term detrimental. So
Unsustainable.
yeah,
Yes.
and unsustainable.
Right.
So I grew up in a city, in Kaduna, where my father had a house, but we also had a farm, and that's because my father's father was a farmer, and I remember always growing up going back home to my hometown with my dad, and he would really be coming back from a farm with a
Right.
hoe with him. So I
So
lived.
you're really a farmer boy, are you?
Yeah, I think I am. I mean, my grandfather was a farmer. My dad was an architect,
Yeah.
but also a farmer. So in some sense, I think I'm kind of a third generation architect who thinks like a farmer.
Okay. Let's hear some architectural farmer thinking.
Well, I mean, it's all work in progress, really.
Yeah.
Um, I think it also alludes to my interest in the environment and interest in being very connected, because I grew up with animals, with gardens, with constantly being immersed in nature, and also one minute I'm in this part of the world, and next minute I'm in the dry zone, and so I'm constantly inspired by the environment. I'm constantly inspired by the changes. I'm also much more aware, in that sense of just
Yeah.
the nature, and how our relationship with the environment can really improve our well-being. And uh,
Let's talk about the animal for a minute, all right? Because you brought it up a couple of times.
okay,
I mean, one experience I have had, Kunle,
yeah,
is the sort of a lack of relationship with the animal
yeah,
in
urban,
my experience in
yeah,
America.
yes,
They have pets and so on,
yeah,
and we have a pet.
yeah.
But that's not the relationship to the animal that I think you are talking about.
No, no. No, I mean we do have pets, and it's a very good point. And even unfortunately, even with my love and historical or childhood relationship with animals, I still don't have an animal at this point, just because of my urban living, I guess. But
Yeah, yeah,
I do hope
yeah.
like I
And
can
your itinerant living, yes.
yeah, itinerant living also. But you know, when I grew up, I we had I mean, we're just constantly immersed in all forms of life, essentially, you know, and that includes you know animals that were pets, but animals that were wild and animals that were you know just running around,
On the street,
lizards, you know, on
yeah.
the streets, you know,
Wild, yeah.
birds, you know, all forms of just nature that and even we had I had horses, we had goats, we had you know pigeons, we had rabbits, we had poultry farm animals, we had goats, and literally in the city, like in the city, in you know a large landscape. We my father, he was a poultry farmer. He was also we had rabbits, you know, and
Right.
so there were some of them were for consumption, some of them were for pets, some of them um, were just wild and part of the nature, and you know
And do you miss all this, and Kunle? Do you miss all this now?
I do in some ways. I think what I miss most is my is you know what I feel a little bit yeah what I do miss most is my inability at the moment to structure my life in a way to recreate those kinds of conditions.
Right,
You
right,
know?
right.
And I think it's an incredible luxury to allow yourself to have the time and the you know and just the environment. You know,
Yeah, to be able to.
yeah,
Well, you brought up your father a few times already, and of course, one of the things you and I have in common is we are both descended from architect fathers, and
indeed.
architect fathers whom I suspect in both our cases were, let's say, big personalities. So today, when you are a well established practitioner in your own right, how do you sort of remember your relationship with your father as an influence, as a governing influence in your life?
Hmm, it's a very good point. You know, my father never once said Kunle should be an architect.
Uh-huh.
You know, I don't ever remember.
Maybe that's the damning thing, because that means you had to make your own.
Indeed, indeed. And when I was younger, you know, I didn't want to be an architect.
Uh-huh.
I almost refused it. Yeah, I refused, and you know, everyone said, "Oh, you know, you draw well. You know, you're you're creative. You're this. You're making always making stuff. You're going to be an architect, just like your father."
Right,
Uh,
right.
and I was sort of a rebellious little kid saying, "Oh no, no, I want to be a pilot. You know, I want to be." But I remember that my father, whilst he never said, "Okay, you know, why don't you be an architect or think about architecture?" I think he was very subtle in ensuring that he provided me everything to support my talent or my interests, or you know, as you know, as someone who was interested in um, arts, creativity, you know,
Right.
and he would always involve me in the process. You know, we would go out to his project sites and travel together. And you know, I remember him teaching me very simple things like how to see if there's a if a building or the surface of a building is horizontal by looking it against the horizon, you know, back in the days,
Aha.
you know.
I see.
You
Yes.
know, very subtle things like that that would we would sit and talk on end about how to create a room that you would or a space that when you got into like get into a house and where you should leave your keys, the mantelpiece is so important.
Hmm.
these sort of details, I still remember very clearly that, and that attention to detail, attention to space organization, attention to colors, and trying different things and constantly modifying the house, improving, adding to it, making it, expanding it, growing. So I think that had a huge influence on me. And when it
Kind
became
of the
time for me,
ethos of architecture, the sort of the experience and being of architecture
yeah,
rather than,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and talk about ventilation, and so I learned all of these things just by being with him. And
But you must have wanted to take distance from him at the same time in some way, no?
I think because it was just quite obvious, and of course you have people, family, everyone coming and making a claim that they know what your life would be as a child. All right, why would you say
Yeah,
you
I
know
know
what
all
I'm gonna
about
do?
that. Yeah,
I want to know. I want to do something else.
yeah,
That when it came time for me to make a decision about school, I really, had a chat with one of my uncles, and he said, "Look, what do you do? What do you feel like when you wake up in the morning? What do you enjoy doing most? And yeah, I just realized I do enjoy making things. I do enjoy creating worlds. I do enjoy imagining and making things happen."
Now, but then at the age of 25, from architecture school, you ended up working at OMA, and you ended up, I think, working quite closely with REM. Uh, what was that relationship like by comparison and contrast? I mean, was he, let's say, was he kind of an alt father figure also for you?
I think so. I think um, ultimately, and still is in some ways. I think is an
Uh-huh.
incredible uh, man, from an intellectual, professional, you know, point of view. But I was also very fortunate to have had a very close and still relatively close relationship with him.
Yeah.
Um, and we were in communication a lot in the years that I worked with him, at OMA.
Yeah.
And very early, I began leading projects, which meant, um, you know, I had direct communications, and back in the days, whether it's faxes or text messages, phone calls, we probably communicated every day. Um,
But how did that happen? What was that nature? I mean, yeah, I'm gonna provocatively say, how did you end up being a favored son?
you mean at OMA or being
OMA,
in itself?
or yeah,
Yeah,
anyway, yeah,
I think I don't know. People, there are, you decide you get along with people or you don't, and I don't think I was. It was an office with 200 people or maybe a little less back then, and REM would had project leaders or people who, and I think he would he's very, very, very good at identifying people and allowing them to basically just claim responsibility,
right.
and if you and that's the thing with OMA. If you can claim that responsibility and sink your teeth into it and you perform, and you can, you know you have you're able to communicate with him and get projects going, you'll be favored, and you'd be allowed to do things that you need to do. So I think it was just a natural consequence
Right.
of my capacity and his interest, and um, obviously how he also sees his own office being his office constituency, right? So
So compare that with your relationship with your own father. Do you think you had a similarly close relationship with your own father?
um, with Rem, it was very much about it was, of course, I was working for him. I
Right. Of course.
and that has slightly different point. But regardless of that, we also had a lot of time outside, or in between work, where we would you know have dinner, have drinks, meet people with family. I'm also close friends with his uh, kids, and so that also created more personal and intimate um, relationships.
Right.
But with my father, it was I never really worked for him. I did do some, you could call it like an internship with him, very when I was 16,
Mm-hmm.
even before I started college, when he basically bought me an old computer at the time, like it didn't even run AutoCAD. I think it was like and I probably used what seemed to be like Corel Draw back then to do
Right.
the
I
plan
can feel that.
for a house and for his friend, which was built. So
Yeah.
now this was just like, holiday little thing on the side, and you know just play around with it, and that's the kind of relationship I've always had. Almost like he made architecture my hobby. He
I
allowed
see.
it to be my hobby, to be something I really just enjoyed doing, and there was no pressure of you know there was no pressure. Of course, with Rem in the
Right.
office, there's always pressure.
Expectations. Yeah, there is always pressure, always expectation. But your father was I want to shift the conversation a little bit. So your father was a modernist, right? Would you describe him as a modernist? And there is a sort of a strong modernist heritage in Nigeria, of course. I wonder what your thoughts are today with with the pressing concerns of the environment and sort of diversity that as you are articulating it. What's your thoughts on the legacy and history of modernism in Nigeria and in the world in general? I mean, what do you have? What are your thoughts about that?
My father was raised in he was raised in or he started his active practice in the 60s um, and early 70s, and that's when he schooled in the 60s and started his active practice, I think late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah,
um, and and back then, I think what you know the architecture movement then was really invested in ideas of tropical architecture, tropicalism,
right. Yeah. Tropical, yeah,
yeah, and that's important. That was an important phase in the history of architecture generally. I would say in most part of the continent,
right.
where even he was also partly taught by British and American uh, uh, architects who
Yeah.
who came and worked at University of Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria in Kaduna.
Yeah.
And but I think at the time, um, the idea of modernism, which is really fundamentally a movement that tried to modify traditional beliefs, right?
Right.
And whether it's traditional beliefs or the kind of ideas for what um, architecture forms and spaces and should be, which was going across the world, whether it's in America and in Europe. Um, when it tried to take foothold, this is my view, that in Africa, when it tried to take foothold in Africa, rejecting traditional trends and what seems to be contextual was very difficult. So what you got was really this hybrid uh,
Hmm.
of trying to, you cannot just refute the African context is so
Strong.
strong,
So,
right?
yeah,
The
yeah.
climate is so harsh, the materials you have to kind of work, and what happened was that where pure modernism could have taken foothold in Europe and America, when it came into Africa, it wasn't. You cannot really define it as African modernism,
Mm.
or maybe it is, but it really was now confounded into what you would call tropical architecture. And we had movements with you had these with different architects in the period. So my father was part of that, right? Where
Right.
materials and the you cannot. It's just not a. It's the outcome of the architecture was never pure without regard for the context. Um,
Right.
and I think some of the greatest architecture was produced in that period.
Right. Right.
Were produced in that period.
So,
Um,
so
and
talk to me in this context.
yeah,
As we here move towards our last 10 minutes or so,
yeah,
uh, talk to me about Lagos and Nigeria, and by inference or extension,
yeah.
Africa today. And what is your what are the challenges of working there today, and what is your sense of where we are going?
Mm,
You know, what do you think is do you think we are in a crisis, or do you think things look good, or
yeah.
where do you think we are?
Well, Africa is an incredible continent. Not because uh, I mean, when I think about think about the statistics that we have, I think
Yeah,
purely
sure.
from that point, it's quite staggering,
Of
um,
course.
and that it's also an incredible continent because it has a lot of challenges, which, in my view, presents opportunities for new ways of living,
Right.
building, and just thinking, essentially. And uh, you know, from its demographics, I think the demographics of Africa is one of its greatest assets,
Right.
because it's the second most urbanizing continent in the world after Asia. It
Yeah, yeah.
has the it has the highest percentage of young population between 19 and 25 in the world. Um, so that's a lot of human capital, right?
Right. Right.
And
So you think it looks optimistic?
I think it's opportunity. It's a place with incredible opportunities, and with time, I mean, time. It's only time that can tell how that opportunity is converted, and I'm beginning to see signs in other aspects of life which points towards optimism. And I'll say those areas would be in the culture and in the arts, and when culture and art start to take foothold in any society, that's a sign of good health of any society, right? So
Okay.
the music industry is growing, film, literature is becoming, there are known great people coming out of that. People are beginning to fashion. There are lots of things really growing on the continent.
Right.
Still challenges of governance. There's still challenges of providing infrastructure. Um, the challenges of very basic things of managing resources, relationships with the rest of the world. I think in this in this cycle of civilization that the continent is going through again, we may have a greater opportunity to make the right decisions, and which would eventually um, be better for the entire for most of the continent. And architecture is a little bit behind on this trend
Uh
of,
huh.
of improvement. Because when you look at all of these arts that I mentioned are doing well, some of the ingredients that make them successful really include very simple ideas that people are talking about today, but architecture has not caught on to. And that's that you need to look inwards. You need to first of all understand your local context, and then add it to relevant global
Right.
values. Whether it's the music is great and people enjoy their culture and they're authentic and they're real and they kind of embrace the identity. Um, and I think
Huh.
architecture needs to develop its own language that really understands its local context while integrating useful international values.
So and I know that you're and you have a book on water cities in the work.
Yeah.
Uh, so why are you focused in particular on the question of water? I mean, yes, there is water everywhere and in Africa, but lots more land and forest and so on. Why water?
In 2011, I was when I began NLÉ, I was just purely searching for opportunities or actually looking at challenges I could tackle, and I had a chat um, with someone in Lagos State government, with Lagos being largest city in Africa population wise, and if
Hmm.
you really want to sink your teeth into some of the urban challenges of Africa, you need to take a look at a city like Lagos. So that's what I did, and they said, well, affordable housing was something that I could help look into. So I was researching affordable housing and looking at how what the to kind of understand housing, I needed to find people that were building the cheapest dwellings as a typology.
Right.
And that's how I came upon the Makoko, which is a city, a community on water that built essentially what you would describe as a slum with
Yeah. Yeah.
thousands of people using almost, very little resources, no infrastructure, but building homes and being able to sustain themselves. And I thought if I could learn from that and improve that might be an insight into how to tackle issues of building relatively cheaply. And in doing that, in that period, I it coincided with a very, I would say, an epic moment where there was a huge flood in Lagos in 2011, July
Yeah.
10th. And it was almost an epiphany to me that I realized that wow, the entire city got flooded on that day, and it struck me that we were not only dealing with the challenges of urbanization and housing and this, but also beginning to deal with this condition of climate change.
Right.
So,
Right.
and
Right.
what is that evidenced by in the most kind of obvious way? And to most people, it's just flooding and it's water and it's the relationship between cities and water. And
I
that's
see.
at the point that I realized that there was an increasing um, um, connection between cities that were expanding rapidly in Africa and cities that are being affected by climate change. And and and,
Right.
and so I launched the Africa project that I call the African Water Cities Project, which really looks like at the intersection points between issues of growth, urbanization, population growth, and climate change, which is evidenced by flooding and issues of growth along water areas. But without even going that deeply, it's a very known and simple fact when you think about it that nearly 80% of all major cities and capitals around the world are settled around water, and
Right.
that's not unusual because the history of human civilization has always been that we've settled along water, fertile crescent in Mesopotamia,
Right.
and as a way of resource. So
The
the
Nile,
idea
the
of
Indus. Yeah.
researching and looking at the what's happening in African cities, we identified 20 top African cities that were growing rapidly, but also being affected by climate change. To start to
Right.
look at what's happening, adaptations around them, and looking at the relationships between the city and water. And that's
Right.
essentially the backbone of African Water Cities, the backbone of Makoko Floating School, which is really one of many potential solutions and many ideas of creating a prototype of uh, architecture or infrastructure that can coexist uh, uh, between between the issues of humanity's growth and the
Right.
environment,
Right.
which is what evidenced by water.
Right. So you are preparing for the great flood. Well, thank you for doing that, Kunle, and thank you for being my guest on Architecture Talk.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure always talking to you. So.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.